Today I'm pleased to talk you about the case of appropriation of scientific aesthetics in Soviet creative or art photography. And precisely, I will focus on equidensities and their employment in the practice of Kharkiv-based photographer Oleg Maliovany. So the relation that official Soviet photography maintains from the end of the 1950s to the mid-1970s with the scientific world is extremely strong. Scientists, scientific institutions, and evidences of technical progresses were praised as particularly noble and worthy subjects. It concerned both professional press photographers and amateurs. In 1958, in the first issue, Sovetskaya Photo magazine published one of the numerous guidelines for amateur photographers. I quote, "The 20th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union set exceptionally important tasks regarding the development of our industry, technical progress, and improvement of our production organization, as well as in the field of construction. Apparently, amateur photographers should focus their attention primarily on these problems." End of the quote. One of the most famous and widespread photos throughout official journals and magazines in the late period of Soviet Union was a portrait of a physicist, Vsevolod Balashov, made by photographer Vsevolod Tarasevich as a part of the series dedicated to the Moscow State University. This photograph may be considered as the most emblematic picture for the whole generation, which found the science as a new cult after the Khrushchev's denouncement of the personality cult of Joseph Stalin. On the other hand, links between art photography of the same period and the science are far more complex than just a mere relation of representation. Both scientific imagery and art photography seek to increase the expressiveness of photography using special procedures and interventions. Both consider a photographic images as an amount of modifiable parameters and characteristics. Finally, development of photographic materials and procedures for science research can directly benefit art photography as well. One of the paradigmatic examples of this relation is a series of equidensities made by Kharkiv photographer Oleg Maliovany between 1968 and 1975. So, equidensitometry is a method of photometry where the original black and white image is transformed in such a way that areas of the same density became immediately visible. The zones of equal density are called equidensities. From the beginning of the 1950s, this method of photometry, based either on principle of combining of multiple negatives or on the Sabatier effect, was popularized by employees of the Institute of Optics and Spectroscopy of the Academy of Science of DDR, Ernst Lau and Wolfgang Krag. In the book Application of Scientific Photography, published in 1972, Wolfgang Krag and Hans-Günther Weide claimed that the method is useful for the needs for such fields of science as astrophysics, spectroscopy, radiology, dosimetry, and chemistry. Starting from 1966, the equidensitometry was practiced on a regular basis in the Astronomical Observatory of Pulkovo, that was the main observatory at the Academy of Science of USSR. The objects of such photometry in Pulkovo were basically the comets, and the obtained equidensitograms were always monochromes. In the same time, in the Western literature, we find examples of the use of color equidensities. The color is used here for better interpretation of black and white images. Indeed, the purposeful attribution of specific color to determined optical density allowed an effective differentiation of the shades of the gray-stepped wedge. Nevertheless, the process of fabrication of an equidensity that required the fabrication of numerous intermediate negatives was quite time-consuming. In addition, photographical materials required for the color print were expensive and scarce in the USSR. These are the main reasons explaining why color equidensitometry didn't find a real implementation in the use of any scientific field there. In 1970, the West Germany company Aqua introduced a new film that revolutionized the process of equidensity creation. Under the appellation Aqua Contour Professional, it dramatically reduced the whole procedure to only one step. Apparently, neither scientists nor photographers in the Soviet Union did have access to this Western-produced material. Thus, in 1973, an employee of the Pulkovo Observatory, Nina Bronnikova, published an article describing the Bennett comet photometry using equidensity method. The process that was used in this photometry was still based on the former, more complex procedure. Nevertheless, the Soviet audience was familiar with Aqua Contour. The mouthpiece of the official photography, Sovetskaya Photo magazine, published in the 7th issue of 1971 several equidensities made with the use of Aqua Contour. These images were published as a part of the story about the exhibition Intercamera 71, held in Prague. Aqua Contour was a prizer of this Photo and Cinema Technologies review. Describing its obvious advantages and insisting on the usefulness of this film for scientific research, the author of the article mentions only in passing its interest for the art photography. However, it was precisely in the creative experiments of the Kharkiv-based photographer Oleg Maliovany that equidensities found one of the most prominent and intensive use in Soviet Union. In the reality of Soviet material situation, photography remained a handwork craft, requiring from photographer advanced technical knowledges and skills. As professional photographic education was inexistent, someone willing to practice photography professionally usually had an engineering degree. That was the way of Oleg Maliovany, who in the former Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, in the Kharkiv city, pursued his training as metallurgical engineer. Even though he chose photography as his main occupation, the passion that he cherished for chemistry influenced durably his practice. The issues of Sovetskaya Photo magazine dated from the 1960s to 1970s allow us to establish the main value assigned by photographic theory of the time to photography. It was precisely its character of the document, its connection with reality, and reliability of its testimony. Documentary press photography was considered as the ultimate expression of this value, which brought it to the forefront of photographic practices. In opposition to the recurrent appeals of the authors of this magazine to be faithful to the reality of life, Oleg Maliovany from the mid-1960s, on the contrary, sought to sever the link between photography and its referent. From this time, he adopted in his practice methods that radically transformed the photographic images by bringing it closer to the graphic arts. In his early monochrome group of works made between 1965 and 1971, we find a couple of portraits, both individual and double, treated with pseudo-solarization or posterization technique. Unlike the photographs of working, beautiful, and glorious citizen omnipresent on all official image-disturbing channels, these people, portrayed by Maliovany, lose all the distinctive signs of their social function, acquiring the features of a certain enigma, tending to monstrosity. Along with this research, he took a keen interest in the use of color photography. At a time where photographic materials were deficient, where the manufacturing process was complex and laborious, there were very few photographers practicing color. Including Maliovany, there were only 2 people in the whole city of Kharkiv who were printing color photography in the late 1960s. The mastery of color itself was a challenge. It required a desire to transform the poor material, to subjugate it to the will of photographer. The technique of equidensities, allowing the attribution of colors defined by the author's imagination to particular areas of images, is another step in this direction. More than just a color photograph, this technique allowed Maliovany to achieve vibrant color images while giving the photographer more freedom and control. According to Maliovany, he discovered the equidensities formula for the first time in 1965 in a magazine devoted to artistic photography. Later, subsequently to the visiting of an exhibition showing the cosmic photography in Moscow in the end of 1960s, Maliovany developed a keen interest about the process and introduced it into his practice. However, first experiments didn't result in immediate success. Indeed, if this technique allows the photographer to deliberately assign different color to areas of the same density, one of the major problems that occurs is to find the right balance of color, of hues. While he created the first equidensity in 1969, it took him 2 years of research and exchanges with a friend, professor of color science at Kharkiv Civil Engineering Institute, before he produced satisfying works. Visually, the color equidensity is comparable to color pasteurization. In Soviet Union, color pasteurization is called also isopolychromy. Invented in 1957 by Lithuanian Povilas Karpavičius, this method is just as complex as that of color equidensity. Only photographers mastering all the subtleties of the photographic process manage to achieve isopolychromies. However, techniques for producing color equidensities and isopolychromies are very different. The former is distinguished in particular by the precision of color application on a delimited area, as well as the purity and saturation of color that it allowed. Despite the undeniable authority of press photography in the Soviet official discourse, the demonstration of technical virtuosity and mastery of color are sufficiently solid arguments for magazines and other official printed issues who started publishing the isopolychromies at least since 1967. The equidensities of Oleg Maliovany also found an official acceptance and even greetings. For instance, the equidensity Old Stalin has been published at least twice as a back cover of Sovetskaya Photo magazine in the 8th issue of 1976, and secondly, in the catalog of exhibition Interpress Photo 77. In addition, Maliovany claims to have won in 1976 an all-union television photography contest in which he presented some equidensities. However, it must be noted that this recognition affected only a small part of Maliovany equidensities. Only the cityscapes composed according to the classical rules of pictorial composition, showing the buildings of the old quarters of the cities of the Baltic countries, fitted the comfort zone of the Soviet censorship. However, most of Maliovany equidensities were totally excluded from the official visibility. Oleg Maliovany wasn't an isolated experimenter in Kharkiv at that time. From 1971 to 1972, he was taking part of the group of photographers who opposed repetitive and redundant, as William Flusser would define it, official photography. Gathered under the name of the Vremya Group, its members developed the blow theory, which they used to appreciate the value of photography. According to this theory, a good photography should affect the viewer as a blow in the face. Each member of the group, among other now famous Boris Mikhailov, had their own means of making this blow happen. Maliovany's photographic work, and in particular his equidensities, were characterized by a frequent use of nudity. Outlawed and stigmatized like pornography in the Soviet Union, the image of the naked woman is used most often by Maliovany as a metaphor. This character is emphasized by the titles of these photographs, evoking completely abstract concepts. While some of his work containing representation of nudity obtained the highest distinction in salons organized by the International Federation of Photographic Art, you can observe, for instance, stamps of these salons on the back of one of his equidensities. They were totally excluded from any official distribution circuits in the Soviet Union. This also concerns images where we find the deformation of human figure, providing them with a deliberately sinister aspect. The title Phantom suggests that the disturbing impression that some of these images give off is fully intentional. About the work Nude Trio, Maliovany tells an anecdote. The work was one of the photographs that traveled between photography clubs at Soviet Union with the aim of collecting opinions and critics from colleagues of other cities. Once the Book of Commons returned, Maliovany, astonished, read a following note about the new trio. It seems that the composition features 3 frozen dead bodies that have started to decompose. Finally, the composition representing a situation of imminent danger is one of the most recurring themes in Maliovany's photographs. The Echidensity No. 1 presents one of the first cases of its appearance in his work. The obvious foreignness of a female figure, together with the pushing aside gesture of the palms and her nakedness, rhymes with vulnerability. It enhances the drama already started by loud colors. This anxious and even ominous tone, as well as the constant presence of something unknown and potentially threatening in the fabric of reality, clearly contrast with the dogmatic aesthetics and the optimistic tone of the Soviet official photography. The absence of social optimism and the desire to overstep the standardized visual language brings Maliovany photographic work closer to the new Soviet science fiction, which emerged between 1958 and 1962. Thus, the generation that lost the solid and well-defined basic concept of the world structure, the generation of the 20th Communist Party Congress, was fascinated both by science and science fiction. From the 1960s, the Soviet book industry actively translated Western science fiction writers such as Ray Bradbury, Isaac Asimov, Clifford Simak, and others. However, started from this time, an important movement for freedom from dogmas and cliches began in the Soviet science fiction as well. Masterfully dodging the imperative of the joyful green of social realism, some of the Soviet writers, such as the brothers Strugatsky, Ilya Varshavsky, Olga Larionova, Volodymyr Savchenko, Ariadna Gromova, and others, laid the foundation for a new direction in the new sci-fi literature. New science fiction created authentic examples of comic essays and even explicit social satire. It rejected the explanatory role of an author, a compulsory topic back then, bringing to the literature a new psychological and reflexive time, different from the linear time of progress as defined by historical materialism. Some of them pointed out the discrepancy of the technical and social development. So, the new science fiction suggested to the Soviet readers the precedence of expression of life in art, the rejection of the conventionality of the ideological language, and the freedom to pose questions that couldn't be replied to with definitive answers. Maliovany shared with the sci-fi author of The New Way the practice of creation of alternative worlds, suspicious of optimism about the inevitable and linear progress, as well as the research of a new, adequate and contemporary artistic language. To summarize, even in the privileged field that was the world of sciences in Soviet Union, Western material, namely aqua control film, which simplified considerably the process of echidensities production, were inaccessible. The underdevelopment of the printing process of color photography made the technique of color echidensities theoretically practical for purposes of photometry, invalid in practice. On the other hand, the case of Oleg Maliovany echidensities is a remarkable example of appropriation of the scientific method in artistic photography. This laborious and time-consuming technique met the specific and actual needs of his then vanguard photographical practice, providing the photographer with possibilities to manipulate colors without regard to the actual tint of represented object. The echidensities impress the audience with the vividness of colors as well as their eccentricity. The various Soviet institutions were receptive to the effects of colors that experiments that echidensities proposed. Yet, Oleg Maliovany's practice exceeded the limits of official aesthetics. Thus, using a noble technique in the sense that it would serve the needs of science, he diverted its use in order to create images that were impressive, but inconvenient or even disturbing. The diversion of uses which the anthropologist Alexei Yurchak would call a performative shift characterizes the late stage of Soviet history. while the equidensity method would be used in science with the aim of obtaining more information about represented objects, the equidensities of Oleg Maliovany, by underlying his intervention in photographic image and by demonstrating its constructed and manipulated nature, undermines the then official dogma of the photography as imprint of reality. Thank you very much for your attention.